And joining me now is Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah. Romney, of course, was the Republican nominee for president in 2012. Senator Romney, welcome back to Meet the Press. Thank you for being here.
Happy to join you, Kristen.
A lot of headlines to get to, but let's start with that Texas abortion case. The state Supreme Court, as you know, put a hold on a lower court's decision to allow Kate Cox to have what her doctors say would be a medically necessary and potentially life-saving abortion. Now, her fetus has been diagnosed with a fatal condition, and if she carries it to term, doctors say it could jeopardize her ability to have more children in the future, something that she says she very much wants. What is your reaction, and should Kate Cox have the ability to terminate her pregnancy?
Well, I'm not going to stand in for the courts. They're going to evaluate the evidence. I am pro-life, but people like me that are pro-life also believe that when a woman's life is in danger, the opportunity for an abortion should be apparent for her. So we'll see what the court ultimately gets to, but recognize after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and the decision went back to the elected officials in the various states, there are a lot of parameters and nuances that haven't been sorted through yet. That's going to happen in Texas and other places, and ultimately we're going to find a settled understanding. And
as you're indicating, you did support overturning Roe v. Wade, but was this what you imagined when you supported Roe v. Wade being overturned, that a woman who'd been told by her doctors that she needs an abortion potentially to save her own life would be denied one?
Well, I think the question here will be whether or not, in fact, her life is at risk. And if it is at risk, then I think under Texas law, although I'm not an expert in Texas law, under Texas law, she'll be allowed to have an abortion. But each state's going to have to make this decision. And I, stepping back, I think you have to recognize when you have an issue that the nation is divided on, where, particularly when it's a moral issue, when some people feel it's a moral wrong to have an abortion, and others feels that it should be a moral right for a woman to be able to choose. In a setting like that, you don't want to have a small group decide to impose their will on everybody else. There's got to be some kind of meeting towards the middle. That hasn't happened yet. I hope that does happen in Texas and in every other state. And ultimately, that's the way America works. We can't have people pulling each other apart and insisting that they have to have 100% of what they want, and the other side gets nothing of what they want.
Well, and speaking of that, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who is fighting the lower court's decision, is threatening criminal prosecution for anyone who helps Kate Cox get an abortion, including her doctors. Does that go too far? Do you think that her doctors should be punished if the court rules that she is entitled to this abortion?
Well, certainly in Texas, as in every other state, they're going to follow the law. But I think in many cases, politicians play to their base, play to the crowd. In this case, let's let the courts adjudicate what the parameters are going to be of abortion in Texas and elsewhere. And ultimately, this has got to be settled, not by one side, again, imposing its will on everybody else, but both sides working together where each gets something. And that hasn't happened yet.
Okay. Let's turn to those comments that we just played by former President Donald Trump. As you heard, he said he would not be a dictator except for day one. At an event in New York last night, he tried to downplay that. But what was your reaction to hearing those words, Senator? Do you believe him?
You know, when I was a kid, there was something called a gumball machine. You could put a penny in and a gumball would come out. It was automatic. There was no filter. Put in the penny, out came the gumball. Donald Trump is kind of a human gumball machine, which is a thought or a notion comes in and it comes out of his mouth. There's not a lot of filter that goes on. There's not a lot of what's the implication. No, he just says whatever. I don't attach an enormous amount of impact to the particular words that come out and try and evaluate each one of them. I do think you can look at his record as president, and particularly in the last months of his presidency, and say, this is a dangerous approach, it's an authoritarian approach. That gives me far more concern than him playing to the crowd as he did.
Well, given that you're saying he gives these unfiltered responses, we have actually seen him do what he says he's going to do. When he said that he believed the election was going to be rigged before people actually went to the polls, he went on to question the results, tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Why don't you take him exactly at his word?
Oh, I think we agree that we have looked at his behavior, and his behavior suggests that this is a person who will impose his will, if he can, on the judicial system, on the legislative branch, and on the entire nation. I mean, when he called people to come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, that was not a random date. That was the date when peaceful transfer of power was to occur. He called that on purpose. I mean, there's no question he has authoritarian rulings and interests and notions which he will try and impose. That's dangerous for the country. It was dangerous then. Life was lost. We were embarrassed around the world. I mean, this was a tragedy. And a number of the things he did in the last months of his presidency suggest what he'd do if he were elected again.
I want to drill down on you on just how dangerous, as you say, you perceive former President Trump to be. Liz Cheney put this into dire terms this week. She told my colleague Savannah Guthrie, quote, "There's no question Trump would refuse to leave office if he's reelected." She went so far as to say a vote for him may mean the last election that you ever get to vote in. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't think Donald Trump would want to stay in longer than 4 years. And the reason I say that is because I think he's running for retribution, and I think he will have finished his retribution after 4 years if he's elected. I don't think he particularly likes being around the White House. I think he'd rather be back at Mar-a-Lago or other properties of his. But he wants to show that he's not a loser. He won, and he wants to go after the people who were tough on him. So I think he'll be finished after 4 years and go back to other occupations.
Given everything that we have heard from former President Trump, what do you think a second Trump term would look like?
Well, I think if you can look at the last few months of his presidency, you'd suggest that that's the kind of thing you might see, that he would not have the generals around him as he did last time, people of judgment and experience offering advice, and in some cases restraining his impulses. Instead, he would have people around him encouraging his impulses and perhaps adding to them. And I'm afraid you'd find the nation more divided. Look, our nation doesn't need to be divided right now. A campaign based on anger and hate may win at the ballot box temporarily, but it tears the country apart. The other day, the former president said that we are at greater threat for what is within. I think that was in some respects a self-own, because what's within, if he were to become elected president again, is a campaign of retribution and anger and hate. That's not what America is based on. America was based on the idea of in God we trust and united we stand. Divided we fall. Divided nation is not the nation America is intended to be.
All right, well, let's move on to Hunter Biden and the headlines around that. As you know, he was indicted on 9 new tax charges this week, the second time he has been indicted by the special counsel this year alone. His lawyers said that if his name was anything other than Biden, the charges would not have been brought. What's your reaction to that? Well,
if his name were anything other than Biden, he wouldn't have been able to bilk millions of dollars from foreign entities. So let's start there. And not only did he take all this money from foreign entities, trading on his father's name, which is ugly and unsavory, he then didn't pay taxes on it, according to the prosecutors. We'll see if they can prove that case. But if they can, he violated U.S. law and should be severely punished for having done so.
As you know, House Republicans have signaled that they may vote as early as this week on an impeachment inquiry into President Biden, despite the fact that they haven't shown yet a direct link between Hunter Biden's business dealings and President Biden. Have you seen any evidence that President Biden has committed high crimes and misdemeanors?
No, I don't see any evidence of that at all. I think before you begin an impeachment inquiry, you ought to have some evidence, some inclination that there's been wrongdoing, and so far there's nothing of that nature that's been provided.
So are you opposed to the impeachment inquiry?
Well, if I were in the House, I'd vote against it, unless they were able to bring forward evidence that suggests that there were a high crime or misdemeanor that had been committed. But so far, that hasn't been the case. Look, fortunately, for most people, we're not responsible for the misdeeds of our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. Nothing in my family I'm embarrassed about. But President Biden's son, Hunter, is obviously been a very unsavory person and has had some extremely damaging personal foibles, including a drug habit and so forth. That's not President Biden, and we're not going to impeach someone because of the sins of their kids.
Okay. Let's talk about that aid package on the Hill, which is under a lot of debate, as you know. The Senate has 1 week left to negotiate this aid package for Israel and Ukraine. Republicans are holding a hard line on border security. What are the implications of not passing aid to Ukraine right now, Senator?
Well, I don't know specifically how quickly the money has to get to Ukraine, the armament has to get to Ukraine, whether we could wait until January. But I can say just a couple things. One is, it's not just Republicans that are holding a hard line. It's Democrats who are holding a hard line. Either side can move and can get this done. And here's the position of my side and our side. And that is, we have gone from 1 to 2,000 encounters, illegal encounters at the border a day, under the three prior presidents, under Bush, Obama, and Trump, 1 to 2,000 a day. Now we're seeing 10 to 12,000 a day. As Pennsylvania's Senator John Fetterman said, we're basically seeing Pittsburgh show up at the border every month, all right? We're at a rate of incursions into the country of about 4 million a year. That's larger than the population of 24 of our states. So we want to solve that, to secure the border. I just saw the President of the United States say that we've got to secure the border. Yeah. He's right. So any effort that doesn't do that will be rejected by Republicans. We want to get it back to the level that existed under the three prior presidents.
And I guess, and you're right, I know that this is a priority for Republicans, and you're right. President Biden has said he's willing to negotiate. It was described to me, you have to get through all of the disagreement around the border to even start addressing the Ukraine and Israel piece of it. Taking a step back, what message do you think it sends to President Putin, to President Xi, when they see that there are a growing number of Republicans who are opposed to writing what they say is a blank check to Ukraine?
Well, we're not going to write a blank check. We're going to evaluate exactly how the money is spent. What we're going to do is provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to defend themselves against a brutal invasion by Putin, who is a thug and a murderer. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I think they realize, I think Putin and Xi recognize that democracy is messy, that our system is not authoritarian. We don't have a king. We don't have a dictator. They're dictators. They like to make a big deal out of the process that we go through. But you know what? It has worked for America in the past. It'll work in the future. We'll get through this. And ultimately, don't forget, the president was the one that put the border and the border security issue as part of this package. This is not a Republican issue. He brought it to the front, and that's why we're dealing with it.
And just very quickly, I mean, you were the first person to call attention to Russia, what you described our #1 geopolitical foe. Are you comfortable with your party's position on Ukraine?
Well, each individual makes their own posture known on a particular issue. My own view is that it's very much in America's interest to see Ukraine successful and to provide the weapons that Ukraine needs to defend itself. Anything other than that would be a huge dereliction of our responsibility, I believe, to the world of democracy, but also to our own national interest. Because if Putin thinks he can invade his neighbor with impunity, and that we're just going to step back, that we're going to say, oh, we're tired, we're not going to keep on helping, then guess what? He's not going to stop. And he's going to go into a NATO nation. That's going to draw NATO and our troops into war with Russia. This is in America's interest to make sure that Ukraine puts up a great fight.
Let me just get your reaction to what we just witnessed. Again, the president of the University of Pennsylvania has now resigned. Should the other two presidents resign?
Well, I'm not going to tell them what they should do, but what they did in that hearing was absolutely repugnant, was outrageous, incomprehensible. It violates the very premises of American unity. We're a diverse nation, not to recognize that calling for the genocide of a people is awful, is hate crime. I mean, this was an extraordinary breach on the part of the judgment of the heads of these universities. And people are saying, wait a second. If a conservative speaker wanted to come to their campus, oh, they'd be all outraged. No, they can't come there. But they're saying it's okay for people to call for genocide of the Jewish people. And by the way, this is not just about Jews, it's about members of Islam. I mean, it's about tolerance for people who are different in our country, and these university presidents have to stand up for that. Their failure to do so was an extraordinary failure.
Well, you take me to my next question, Senator, because you're right. It's about anti-Semitism, yet it's about Islamophobia. It's about hate in all of its forms. Does Congress have a role to play in addressing the issue of hate on college campuses? Should Congress be more engaged in what's happening?
Yeah, not by creating law, but by creating example. And recognize that the people we choose as our leaders are not just going to write law and effectuate policy. They're also setting the character of the country. It's one of the reasons I have such concern about President Trump, which is he has affected the character of America. Look, we are a diverse nation. whether people want it to be that way or not. We are highly diverse, not just by ethnicity, but also by religion, by sexual orientation. I mean, there are a whole series of dimensions in which we're diverse. That's who we are. You may not like it. That's who we are. And the only way a nation as diverse as us is able to be strong is if we recognize the divine nature of humanity, we recognize one another, their faults, and we don't attack each other. Tearing down other Americans, retribution, revenge, anger, that is not the future of a great country.
Let's turn now to the 2024 race as you bring up former President Trump. Why haven't you endorsed a candidate yet, Senator, and do you plan to do so?
Well, because if I endorse someone, it would be the kiss of death. No, I'm not going to do that. Maybe I should pick. Shall I endorse the person I like least right now? Look, I'm not going to be endorsing President Trump, obviously. I've made that very clear. Look, Chris Christie has done a terrific job so far. I think his being in the race has kept Donald Trump from coming to the debates. Because I think Donald Trump recognized if he went to the debate with Chris Christie would reveal him for what he was. And Trump would be badly hurt, so he stayed out. But Nikki Haley, she's rising. Right now, I think she's the only one that has a shot at becoming the nominee, other than President Trump. It's a long shot on her part, but she's the one that has a shot. So we'll see.
Do you think it's time for other candidates, not Nikki Haley, since you think has the momentum right now, to drop out of the race, to start consolidating their support, given what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't think it's my role to tell other people when they should get out. It's too big of a sacrifice and investment by people and their supporters to be running for president, for someone to come in and say, hey, you ought to get out.
Yeah.
But I hope it continues to consolidate and it becomes at some point a two-person race. But even then, I think Donald Trump is a prohibitive favorite.
Let me ask you a little bit more about what Liz Cheney said. She said the country would be better run by Democrats than by Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans. That's not an exact quote, but that's effectively what she has said. Do you agree with her there?
Well, President Biden's policies have not worked for America. I know that the economic statistics are looking better right now, but the American people are hurting. As they go into the grocery store and bread costs $5 a loaf, they recognize that that's a result of Biden's policies. So I'm not going to say Biden's policies are good for America. There's some Democrats out there that I think would do a better job. I hope someone besides President Biden is the nominee of the Democrat Party. We'd see who that might be.
Well, you wrote your wife's name in for president in 2016 and 2020. If there is, in fact, a Biden and Trump rematch, would you vote for President Biden, given what you are saying about former President Trump?
Well, the Joe I would like to vote for is Joe Manchin. And I'm not going to tell you right now who I'm going to vote for. Fortunately, I'm in a state that that's not a swing state. It's not a state in contest. Whoever I vote for in Utah, Utah is going to be for Donald Trump, so it's kind of irrelevant. But I typically vote for Ann for that reason.
Do you think that Senator Manchin's going to run?
No, I don't, but I wish he would.
You're going to encourage him to?
I wish he'd be the Democratic nominee. And by the way, there are a couple of Democrats I might think of that would be a better nominee, I think, than President Biden.
Just to put a fine point on it, though, it sounds like you're not ruling out voting for President Biden.
I'm not going to describe who I'll rule out other than President Trump. I just, you have a setting where you have someone who's too old and someone else who's a little too nutty. And where are you going to vote on that basis? And by the way, in my view, bad policy we can overcome as a country.
Yeah.
We have in the past.
Yeah.
Bad character is something which is very difficult to overcome.
Well, let me ask you, if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee but loses to President Biden, do you think the certification process will be peaceful, or are you concerned that it may not be?
Oh, I think it'll be peaceful. I don't think there's any question but that Vice President Kamala Harris will not try and reject electors from states that are certifying President Biden as one. I just don't think America is going to erupt, but I know there'll be some people who hope that would occur.
Well, let's talk about you and your future, your decision to leave the Senate. You've been adamant you're not going to run for president, so I won't ask you that question. But what is next for you, Senator?
Well, I came here to ask you whether perhaps a position here at NBC News would be available for me. No, I don't have the answer to that. I will continue to work to keep America the hope of the earth and the hope of the people in this country. And whether that's by lecturing in universities or going around the country and speaking or writing another book or two, or maybe just, getting behind some of Ann's ambitions these days. And my wife is leading an extraordinary center for neurologic research. Life is so fantastic. It's so wonderful being alive, and I don't worry about my next chapter.
All right, well, I have to ask you about your dad, George Romney, who was, of course, the governor of Michigan. He also ran for president. You have called him your life's hero. What would he think about the state of the Republican Party today?
Oh, he would not understand it. He would not believe it. The party's very different than it was. Look, and I'm reading a lot of history. I'm reading a book right now called The Age of Acrimony. It talks about the American politics in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Holy cow, the parties were so different back then. When I ran in 2012, the party's different than it is today. President Trump became our nominee. We got all sorts of new people who'd been Democrats forever that flowed into the Republican Party, and a lot of people left. And so it's a different party today than it was then. I think he'd be surprised to see how much it's changed. And I think the social and cultural division that you're seeing today would be of concern to him. But don't forget, when he was a governor, we had race riots, even in his home state of Michigan, in Detroit. So, we're wrestling with some of these divisive issues even today.
All right. Senator Mitt Romney, you are welcome back anytime. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.